praise.
One of the very first things I can remember is staying with my grandma and grandpa, Clarinda and Drake Johnson. Although I was born in Knox County, we moved back for them for a while. I can't really remember this, but I was told that when I was a little boy, one night they couldn't get me to go to bed, and then go to sleep. Grandma was already in the bed in another room, and she said, "Honey, come over here and curl up in the bed with me." I did, and ended up sleeping with her until I was 5 or 6 years old. My dad bought a piece of land off Grandma and Grandpa, and built a little house right next door. There was a big rock in the middle of the property. They put a line on the rock that marked the boundaries of Dad's middle of the property. They put a line on the rock that marked boundaries of Dad's land and Grandpa's land. When the house was finished, I ended up spending most of the time with Grandma and Grandpa.
Grandpa liked to sit on the porch and chew his tobacco. He chewed Red Ox tobacco that was real strong. And he would sometimes send me to a little store about a quarter mile down the road to get his tobacco. Grandma smoked a corn cob pipe, and I would get her pipe tobacco too. It wasn't near as strong as the tobacco that Grandpa used. One time when I stayed with him, Grandma got sick and she didn't feel like getting up out of bed to cook breakfast. She told me what to do, how much of everything to use, and I ended up making biscuits and gravy, the brown gravy that I liked. The biscuits were kind of hard, but Grandma bragged on them and said they were pretty good, and told him that he might have liked them, but making them had given me a headache. And I would stay at their house with Mommy and Daddy. She would make 2 pans of gravy. My older brother, Willard, liked gravy. Hot gravy.
Yeah.
And Mom would make some white gravy for him, then make some brown gravy for me.
My brother Willard and I would play together all the time. Climbing around on that large rock in the yard was one of our favorite things to do. Just like boys, we would fuss and fight sometimes. I can remember one time when we got into it and Grandpa came out and climbed up on the rock. He showed us the mark on it. He then put Willard on Dad's side and put me on his side and dared us to cross the mark. I think that put a stop to the fight. I stayed at the house with Grandpa and Grandma, until Grandpa Jay passed away when I was about 10 years old. Grandma would then go to stay with one of her children and then another. I would go visit her wherever she was staying. I loved to go to my Uncle Vicky Johnson's at Buckhorn to visit in the summer when school was out. I had 2 little sisters born that I can't remember. Eula Jean was born in 1928. and died the next year. When I was almost 3, Dorothy Lee was born but died when she was 1. I also had 4 more brothers, Jimmy, Tommy, Otis, and Evie, and 2 sisters, Dora, Ann, and Margaret.
I began school at Kane School when I was 6. Our house was about a mile from the school. I got to ride the bus with the ones that lived closer to the school block. Caney was a very modern school at the time. It was just about new when I started there. We had a boiler that heated the whole school. We didn't have electricity in the school. We didn't have any at all at Clayton. I guess that's one of the reasons they built the school with big windows. We didn't miss much school either. They would run those buses even if it snowed. There was no lunch provided, and if we had anything to eat, we had to bring it from home. I usually didn't bring anything because I'd rather use lunchtime to play. I'd eat a big breakfast, and by the time I got home, I was starved to death. Behind our house, there was a cold spring where we kept milk and other things we needed to keep cold. If the old milk cow had given any milk that morning, Grandma would always put me back a little glass in a jar and put it in the spring. I guess she did spoil me a little bit.
My first year I was in the primary class and I had Miss Cope for a teacher. When my first year was over, I didn't want to leave her class. She agreed to let me and 3 or 4 others stay in her room. The next year she took the time to teach us out of the first grade books, and I then went on to the second grade after that year. Probably my favorite teacher was my 4th grade teacher, Mrs. Carrie Hunt. She was such a good teacher. At the school they would give you something like a silver dollar if you went the whole year. I had never had perfect attendance, but I wanted to do it in Mrs. Hunt's class. During this year, I got something in my foot and it began to swell and got infected. I had to go to Jackson to see Doc Hogg. I ended up missing a half day, but Miss Hunt didn't count against me. Not only did I get my dollar, but she also gave me a little 2-inch pocket knife. This was the only year that I can remember going the whole year. I also had Gordon Combs and J. Y. Dean for teachers at Caney.
Another special place I remember was the Clay Hall Brethren Church where I went to Sunday school. I remember Sewell Landrum started that church. There was also the sale house located close to the church. People from away from here would send in clothes to the church, and on certain days they would open up the sale house. Women would begin to line up outside the sale house before daylight. When the doors opened, the women would run in and begin to snatch all the clothes they could get their hands on. They were just pushing and shoving and grabbing. They would pile their clothes up and push them back against the wall where they had some of the clothes hung. When they got finished grabbing all they could, they would then sort through their pile and take what they wanted to keep and leave the rest just lying there. Seemed like after about 5 minutes, the tables would be empty. One time, my cousin, Ronald Barnett, and I went for the sale. We went in after the women were already there. We got down where the women were piling their clothes and hid. Ronald would pull some clothes from one pile and move it to another pile, or push the clothes back behind the other clothes. Some of them women were just about ready to fight, thinking that someone else was taking things from their pile of clothes.
If a family wanted to eat back then, you had to have a big garden. There was no place to run and get something to eat. We had a few little stores around, but they didn't have a lot of food. We also had a hog or 2 to kill each year, and we kept chickens. We raised lots of potatoes. We would dig the potatoes and bury them in a hole under the floor of the house to keep them from the wind. Mommy canned all kinds of things like corn and beans. We had apple trees, and Mommy and Grandma would use sulfur to preserve apples. They would put them in a big barrel and they would keep. They didn't taste real good, but when you were hungry, you would eat them. They would cook down the apple peels to make jelly. The old peach trees we had wouldn't bear much, but in the summer, trucks would come by to sell fruit, and Mommy would always get peaches and cane. We raised corn and took it down to my Uncle Squire Stacy, who had a way to grind the corn into meal. He would charge to grind it for the people. Daddy would buy flour. I can remember we always had flour, and it was pretty cheap. Daddy would go to town sometimes, and he would bring home what we called light bread. We would eat that bread just like it was cake. They didn't go to the store in town much, probably because we didn't have much money.
I went rabbit hunting a whole lot with my rabbit dog. He would run the rabbits in the hole, we would set a trap to catch them. I had an uncle, Kenny Clemons, who came down to visit us. He asked me, "Can that dog run rabbits?" I told him, "Sure, that dog can run rabbits." We took the dog and went right around the hill from where we lived. I think we killed 4 or 5 rabbits with that dog on the hunting trip. Kenny was killed in 1945 in a mining accident in Ajax Coal Company at Belen. I guess Kenny was probably my favorite uncle. One time he came to visit, he brought me a fancy cat pistol for Christmas. It looked just like a real pistol. It had caps that went around and it would shoot 6 times. At Christmas time back then, we didn't have many gifts. Mom and Dad would always have fruit and stuff like that for us. I remember laying down the night before Christmas and not being able to go to sleep thinking about Christmas morning. We'd get up and Mom would have everything all sorted out, the bananas, apples, and other things to eat.
People sure have a hard time today when the electricity goes off. They didn't begin to set electric poles around Clapham until I was about 14 years old. That was about the time we moved to town. Of course, Daddy had this little battery charger that we called the power plant that would make some electricity. We lived pretty close to Jelly Allen and her family. Daddy worked on her vehicles, and one time he traded her for this big old clear light battery. It worked like a car battery, and it would put out 32 volts of electricity. Not many people around had anything like that. Daddy would always have someone's radio at home working on it. They ran on big old batteries. I remember Noble's radio shop downtown sold those batteries. There would be prize fights on the radio, and all those fellows would gather down around the house to listen to it. I remember one time the old battery quit about the time the fight was to start. They had been listening to the radio before. I think it was Joe Lewis fighting, and it quit playing. We all used to know all the prize fighters. We listened a lot to the Grand Ole Opry.
There was a shooting I remember that happened close to our house when I was about 9 years old. Daddy had an old car that I guess he had been working on that was parked down by the road. Me and a neighbor, Charles Combs, who lived about a quarter of a mile from where we lived, was sitting out on this old car. I remember seeing the car go down the road. We sat there for a little while and I saw that car come back up the road. The car met somebody walking down the road just a little ways past where we were sitting. That fellow stopped his car right out on the road and opened his door. He got out and they started shooting each other. Tom Sanders was the man that got killed and George Kraft was the man in the car. They had shot each other and George was shot all to pieces, but he lived. I remember people talking about what the shooting was over. They had been playing cards. Back then, men would go over the hill down by the river and get a card game going. They said they got in an argument over that card game. Kraft didn't have a gun, so he went to his house just down the road from where we lived and came back with his gun. Tom was killed right there, but George got over his injuries. When I heard the shots, I thought at first that they were shooting firecrackers, but Charles said, no, they're not, they're shooting each other. Looking back now, it was dangerous. One of those bullets could have came our way. After it was over, I went home. There was talk that I might have to be a witness when they had a trial, but I didn't.
About the time that World War II was ending, Daddy and Mommy moved us to South Jackson. I went to work for Sawyer's Chevrolet and worked there about 2 years. I was making about $10 a week. It was located right across from the Greyhound bus depot. When the war was going on, they didn't make any new cars. Everything went to make vehicles and things for the war. Sawyer's Chevrolet got the first new cars in 1946. Daddy then went to work for Ball Creek Coal Company up at Bewin, and I went with him. I was 17 then. Ed Dignan was one of my bosses, and Otto Dignan was the other boss. They were from Pennsylvania and talked a lot different than we did. I helped Daddy work on those coal trucks. There came an opening for a coal truck driver, but I didn't have my license. Back then, you could get your license in one day. I went down to Jackson and got my license and started driving a coal truck. This was a union mine, and I was making about $14 a day. We would try to make as many loads as we could. I turned the truck up in the ditch one time. I came in and told him I needed a chain, that I was in the ditch. There was an old fellow there that worked there named Jasper. Ed Diggins said, "Hey Jasper, have you got a chain?" The kid tilted over up there on the hill. Otto didn't say much to me, just told me to slow down. I think that's the only trouble I had while working there. I worked there until they closed about 3 or 4 years later.
I then went to work for Dalton's Garage, run by E.B. Dalton. It was a new building back then. This is the same building where I go to church now, up on Quicksand Road. I was called into the Army in 1952. I did my basic training in Maryland and then went down to Atlanta, Georgia, where I took a wheel vehicle repairman's course. I served out my time in Atlanta. After I got out of the Army, I went back to work at Dalton's Garage until old man Dalton died. In 1956, I bought a garage building on North Main Street down by Falls Motel. I have run Clemons Garage ever since, even though it is now located on Old Quicksand Road. While working at Dalton's Garage, my cousin Ronald and I were hanging out one day in front of the courthouse. Back then, they would allow people to have revolvers in the courthouse. Of course, that couldn't happen today. I saw this little young lady walking down the steps carrying a big old guitar. Come to find out, her name was Naomi Arrowwood, and she lived in South Jackson, not far from where we live. We dated for about a year. We had gone up to Clayhole one day, and coming home, I pulled off the side of the road and asked Naomi if she reckoned we could make it on $35 a month. She said yes. We were married by her dad, Jasper Arrowwood, on January 2nd, 1950. We have raised our 6 children, Karen, Mike, David, Lisa, Dana, and Nora in Breathitt County. Naomi and I have been together for almost 60 years.
Happy birthday, Papaw.